In November 2023, the Chinese government ordered all state-owned enterprises to divest their Western investments by 2026. We're talking about $8 trillion being withdrawn from American and European stocks, bonds, and assets. And most people didn't even notice. This is not a theory. It's not a prediction. It has already begun. While analysts sleep on outdated charts and repetitive headlines, China is quietly repositioning its financial empire. And the impact of this will reach you, even if you don't realize it yet. The global financial system you know is being recalibrated behind the scenes, and anyone who believes that everything will remain the same is about to be surprised in the worst possible way. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what stage we're at in a historical cycle that has toppled empires before and is now about to repeat itself. Only this time on a global scale, and time to react is running out. In complete silence, China has begun the largest financial reallocation in its recent history. $8 trillion is being withdrawn from Western markets. This move didn't make headlines, it didn't trigger market alerts, but it has already begun. The most impressive thing isn't just the amount, it's the deadline for this transition. November 2026. This means that in less than 36 months, an avalanche of liquidation will hit bonds, stocks, and assets dependent on Chinese capital. The detail that almost no one notices is that this is not a common economic maneuver. It's the final step in a strategic preparation. This movement involves sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, central banks, and financial spheres of influence linked to China. We're not talking about individual investors leaving the market out of caution. We're talking about the world's largest exporter, the largest creditor of the US, and the epicenter of global production chains, repositioning all its capital. The question almost no one is asking is, why now? And the answer begins to reveal itself when we look at the signals China has been giving since 2010, signals that have been ignored by almost the entire West. This repositioning is not a warning, it's a decision that has been made. And when a move of this magnitude begins, it doesn't go back. Behind the diplomatic curtain, China is undoing decades of integration with Western markets. Money is being converted into gold, strategic reserves, essential commodities, and globally influential infrastructure. What seems like a simple portfolio swap actually marks the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. And this is where everything starts to change. Because this type of movement has happened before. Not with the same values, not with the same protagonists, but with the same logic, the same sequence of events, and the same end result. Collapse. The difference is that this time, the global financial system is more interconnected, more indebted, more dependent on external liquidity, and less prepared than ever. And that makes this movement even more dangerous. But to understand why this repositioning inevitably leads to collapse, you need to know the pattern. A four-phase cycle that has brought down economic empires before, always with the same sequence, always with the same outcome. And it is this pattern that we will explore now. This isn't the first time we've seen an emerging power quietly prepare for economic collapse. It's happened before, exactly like this, with the same pieces, the same signs, the same sequence. There's a four-stage pattern that repeats itself whenever a dominant empire begins to lose global financial control. And understanding this pattern isn't just a matter of history, it's a strategic advantage. Because once you see the cycle, you never again dismiss the signs. It all begins with mutual dependence. This is the stage where two economies become so deeply intertwined that experts say conflict is impossible. Bilateral trade explodes, cross-investments grow, and politicians celebrate an era of economic peace. But that's where the danger lies. Because this interdependence doesn't prevent rupture, it enables it. It is from this that the second stage gains strength. And it is here that everything begins to reverse, even if no one notices. The second stage is that of asymmetrical accumulation. While the dominant empire continues spending, incurring debt, and artificially expanding its consumption, the emerging country begins to accumulate. Reserves, gold, productive power, external influence. The imbalance grows invisibly, the system seems to work, until one day, without warning, it collapses from within. This accumulation is not random, it is strategic preparation. This is where the game changes hands, long before any visible shock occurs. The third stage is the most dangerous, strategic repositioning. This is when the emerging power already has everything it needs, reserves, agreements, allies, alternatives, and begins to prepare for a breakaway. But it does so silently, discreetly, and calculatedly. No official announcements, no aggressive declarations, only subtle moves, bond sales, new trade routes, agreements in alternative currencies. Everything happens behind the scenes. And when the world realizes it, it's already too late. The fourth and final stage is that of controlled demolition. It doesn't happen by chance. It's not an accident. It's triggered. The emerging power uses the very dependency it has built up over decades as a weapon. It attacks where the dominant empire is most vulnerable. Its debt, its currency, its financial system. and it does so without firing a shot. The system collapses because it was designed to do so, to be dismantled from within at the right moment. And now China is exactly on that path. But before confirming this, we need to look at what has already happened 3 times before, and understand why the pattern is confirmed every time. The pattern isn't theoretical, it has already happened. And when you observe past cycles carefully, something becomes very clear. The repetition is too precise to be a coincidence. The difference between understanding history and simply remembering dates lies in the ability to recognize patterns. And in this case, the pattern is so precise, so calculated, that it seems like a script being followed step by step, only the actors change. The first time this cycle became visible was between England and Germany, from 1900 to 1914. Germany was the emerging power. It industrialized rapidly, accumulated reserves, drastically reduced its exposure to the pound, and began to form parallel economic alliances, all in silence. The pound was the dominant currency, the world's financial center was London, and no one in the British Empire believed that this could collapse, until the demolition began with the collapse of the British banking system, even before the first shot of the First World War. And the detail that almost no one notices is that the economic war came before the military one. The second case was between the United States and Japan, from 1950 to 1990. Japan, rebuilt with American support, became the largest creditor of the U.S. It began buying strategic assets, companies, land, cultural icons, while simultaneously accumulating billions in reserves. The turning point came in 1987 with the collapse of the American stock market, which was preceded by coordinated sales of Japanese institutions. What seemed like a simple crisis of confidence was, in fact, the closest rehearsal for what would become a silent economic war. And this is where many people are wrong. It was not an accident. It was a test of power. The third example is much more recent, Europe and Russia, from 2000 to 2022. For 2 decades, Europe became dependent on Russian gas. In parallel, Russia accumulated reserves, diversified its economy, and built alternatives to the SWIFT system. When it invaded Ukraine, the West's response was massive in sanctions. But instead of collapsing, Russia turned the tables and used energy as a weapon. It cut off supplies, forced recessions, and paralyzed industries, without firing directly at Europe. The real war was financial, and Europe, to this day, feels the effects of a system that was not prepared for the disruption. These 3 cases have cultural, technological, and political differences, but they share the same sequence, the same pattern, the same ending. Mutual dependence, accumulation, repositioning, demolition. The cycle repeats itself because the human factor remains the same. The arrogance of the dominant empire and the silent strategy of the rising power. Now, all signs indicate that China is following this same script, only this time on a global scale. And if you think that's an exaggeration, wait until you see what they've been doing behind the scenes. And while the world focused on trade disputes, social media, and military tensions, China was doing something far more serious and far more invisible, rebuilding its economic power behind the scenes, not with speeches, but with reserves, not with threats, but with strategy. Over the past 2 decades, the country has amassed more than $3 trillion in international reserves, much of it in dollars, giving China the power to pressure the very system that fueled it. But the detail that few noticed is what it did with those reserves afterward. China didn't stand idly by and watch the dollar lose value through money printing. It discreetly converted part of those reserves into gold. Official figures indicate around 2,000 tons, but market estimates already point to something above 5,000 tons. Why gold? Because gold doesn't depend on trust in any government. And because, historically, every monetary rupture begins with a silent move towards gold. Does this seem like just protection? Maybe. But when combined with the next steps, the picture changes completely. In parallel, China launched initiatives that practically created an alternative economic architecture. The main one? The Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion plan connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa with infrastructure financed and controlled by Beijing. More than 150 countries are already integrated. And do you know what detail goes unnoticed? The works are paid for and maintained in yuan, with clauses that diminish the role of the dollar in international trade. This is not influence. It is financial colonization by another means. Furthermore, China created CIPS, an international payment system alternative to SWIFT. By 2023, it was already handling over 150 trillion yuan and growing rapidly. China's official digital currency, the e-yuan, has also been tested in several international agreements, including with energy powerhouses like Russia and the United Arab Emirates. Behind all this lies the real strategy, to create a complete system of transactions and financing that works, even if the West cuts ties. Does that seem like an exaggeration? Just look at who is signing agreements in yuan: Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Pakistan. These moves weren't improvised. They were planned, scaled, and executed with precision. The Western media, focused on momentary scandals, failed to see what was happening. But the reality is that China has spent the last 15 years creating the necessary infrastructure to disconnect from the global financial system, and more importantly, to collapse it from within. And now that everything is ready, comes the most critical moment: strategic repositioning. And that's what we're going to talk about now. China is no longer preparing, it is already repositioning, and that changes everything. After accumulating reserves, building alliances, and developing alternatives to the Western system, the country has entered the most dangerous stage of the cycle, that of silent strategic maneuvering. This is where empires fall and no one notices, until it's too late. It is at this point that collapse ceases to be a possibility and becomes a matter of time. Since 2022, China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds from over $1 trillion to less than $800 billion. Does this seem like just an adjustment? It's not. This is a gradual and deliberate withdrawal from U.S. debt. And the detail that almost no one notices is it's doing this without causing panic, with well-distributed, coordinated, and discrete movements. But the fate is already sealed. When this repositioning is complete, the West will be exposed and without time to react. At the same time, bilateral agreements are replacing the dollar. Russia, Iran, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and several other countries are already negotiating directly in yuan. China is not asking them to abandon the dollar. It is offering an alternative way out, an escape valve for when the current system breaks down. This type of articulation only happens when those who promote it already know that the rupture is inevitable. And the fact that it is becoming the rule and not the exception shows that Stage 3 has already been fully activated. But nothing signals this more clearly than the order issued by the Chinese Communist Party in November 2023. All state-owned enterprises must fully divest from the West by the end of 2026. I repeat, this is not a suggestion. It is not a recommendation. It is an order. Chinese institutional capital, currently present in stocks, real estate, corporate, and government debt in the West, will be completely withdrawn within 3 years. This is not protection. It is separation. And when separation ends, rupture follows. What follows is not speculation. It's the next logical step in the pattern. When a power finishes repositioning itself, it's ready to act. And it's precisely at that moment that it activates the weapon it has spent years building. The system is already armed. The question now is not if China will act, but when. And to understand how this happens and what it will cause in the markets, you need to see what the next stage holds: controlled demolition. The final stage of the pattern doesn't happen slowly, it's triggered. And when China pulls that trigger, the impact will be global, immediate, and irreversible. There will be no prior warning, press conference, or time for adaptation. It will begin with a silent decision behind the scenes: the coordinated liquidation of U.S. Treasury bonds. We're talking about up to $800 billion being dumped into the market, and the consequence of that will be an interest rate shock that the Fed won't be able to contain without printing money on an absurd scale. And here's the blind spot for almost all analysts: the dilemma the U.S. will face has no way out. If interest rates skyrocket, the American government simply won't be able to roll over its debt anymore. The machine grinds to a halt. But if the Fed tries to contain interest rates by printing dollars to buy its own bonds, hyperinflation becomes inevitable. A system based on trust collapses when the currency that sustains it loses value at an increasing rate. This is not an exercise in imagination. This has already happened in dozens of countries. The difference is that now we are talking about the global reserve currency. And if the dollar falls, the entire financial castle built upon it crumbles along with it. And it doesn't stop there. In parallel, China has the real capacity to provoke a global logistical collapse. It doesn't need to cut everything at once. Specific restrictions, environmental reviews, operational delays, or selective regulatory requirements are enough. This is already happening with exports of strategic metals and semiconductors. The detail that few realize is that this will be done with surgical precision. The objective is not to cause immediate revolt, but to implant functional chaos, to make the Western system dysfunctional due to a lack of vital inputs, and to force negotiation under pressure. And that's where the smartest part of the plan comes in: the alternative. China doesn't just want to watch the current system collapse, it wants to offer the new system while the old one falls. CIPS instead of SWIFT, digital yuan instead of the dollar, gold-backed currency instead of debt-backed currency. Developing countries will join out of necessity, not ideology. And this mass migration will accelerate the collapse of the dollar like a domino effect. The West will bleed financially, and China will extend its hand, not as an enemy, but as a new benchmark. This is how Stage 4 works. It's not gratuitous destruction, it's planned replacement. What the world will see is not a direct attack, but an internal collapse, the result of decades of poorly distributed dependence and institutional arrogance. And whoever is on the wrong side of the structure will pay the price. But while many still doubt this can happen, some are already preparing. And that's exactly what we'll talk about now. This collapse won't be the first thing you see in the news. It will affect the price of what you buy, the value of your investments, and the stability of what you believe to be safe. Most people will realize it too late, because they still believe that if something goes wrong, the system will adjust. But here's the point. This collapse won't be an adjustment. It will be a structural breakdown. And traditional assets won't correct, they'll plummet. Shares of major Western companies, funds tied to government debt, real estate in regions inflated by foreign capital, all of this will be impacted, and not by market changes, but by an orchestrated capital flight on a trillion-dollar scale. When this capital leaves, it doesn't come back, and what today seems like a stable asset could turn into dead weight in a matter of months. The detail that almost no one sees is that the crisis is already priced in, it just hasn't been activated yet. Meanwhile, there are sectors that will benefit. Sectors linked to defense, reindustrialization, independent energy, and food security. Companies with local production chains, linked to strategic resources, will explode in value when economic separation becomes official. And those who are positioned will have a front row seat to the general panic. Because whenever one system collapses, another is built, and whoever understands first, wins first. But it's not just about where to invest. It's about understanding the new geoeconomic map. The dollar is no longer untouchable. Gold reserves have returned to the center of the strategy. Diversification has ceased to be a choice and has become a matter of survival. And those who remain 100% exposed to the Western system, relying solely on banks, dollar assets, or global funds, are putting themselves in the line of fire. This is the time to stop and reflect. Are you positioned for what's coming? Are you on the side that will be impacted, or on the side that will adapt? Because the pattern is clear. The history is clear. China is executing the plan, the West is exposed, and the clock is ticking. Whoever understands this now has a chance. Whoever understands later will pay the price. What you just saw is not a theory, it's a pattern, a cycle that has already destroyed entire financial empires. 3 times, always the same way. Always following the same steps, always with the same ending. The difference now is the scale. This time, it's not a country, it's the global financial system. And China has already put its pieces on the board. The only question is, are you playing or being played? Most people will wait for the collapse to happen. You'll see prices fall, the dollar weaken, assets evaporate, and you won't understand why. He'll look for someone to blame, but he won't be able to go back in time. Now is the time to act strategically, not panic. It's time to study, reposition yourself, protect yourself, and above all, understand that the future will not be a continuation of the past. If this content made you think differently, if it broadened your perspective on what's to come, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Because in the next video, I'm going to show you the first sectors to collapse, the currencies that will survive, and the assets that will appreciate the most when the system crashes. History doesn't give warnings before it repeats itself. But you've been warned now.